As always, a great pleasure to be in Hobart, and thank you to Archbishop Porteous and to David for agreeing to have me again and to organising today. Some of you would remember Monty Python, something completely different. I'm not a theologian. I was a school teacher for 18 years, mainly years 11 and 12, taught English. I'm not an academic. I wrote an article for the Conservative Woman in London this week where I started off with George Orwell's comment, and I don't want to offend anyone here, obviously, but George Orwell said some ideas are so stupid, only intellectuals could believe in them. And I think, if you know about, I think it was Lenin's useful idiots in the West. So I'm not an academic. I was a school teacher, and I got involved in the whole debate in Victoria during Mother Russia, or Joan Kerner, when she became Education Minister and then Premier. I was teaching, and she really, sorry about that, she turned education upside down, and she gave a talk at a Fabian Society. And I do respect freedom of speech. I mean, I do believe people have the right, although, as I think one of the Supreme Court judges said, you don't have the right to shout fire in a crowded cinema. So there are times when free speech has to be restricted, and that is a debate within itself. But I respected Joan Kerner because she was explicit. In her talk at the Fabian Society, she said education had to be overthrown, no longer a tool of capitalism, but we would use education to bring about the socialist utopia, to bring about the revolution. And a lot of people, and so many young people don't remember this, but there was a period in the West when communism, socialism, was very popular and seen as a solution to the world's ills. But anyway, I'm here to talk about repressive tolerance, and I will acknowledge someone. I'm not going to acknowledge the country because apparently it's not my country, but that's a whole other debate as well. But Jennifer Oriel, who writes for The Australian, wrote a chapter in cancel culture, and she introduced me to Marcuse. And Marcuse, if you've not read his essay, and I'll briefly talk about it, talks about repressive tolerance. And it goes back to really the Communist Manifesto, which I actually started to reread recently. And again, it was quite fascinating to actually read the source document of what really has changed the world in so many ways. But according to the manifesto, Western societies are riven with structural inequality because of capitalism. The proletariat, the workers, are obviously oppressed by the bourgeoisie, as he called it, Marx and Engels, or they called it. And the solution was to bring about a society without class, a socialist utopia where everybody was equal. And more recently, for those who follow the debates, and I'm sure you all do, in the West, we had not classical Marxism, but what some people call cultural Marxism, which goes back to the Frankfurt School in Germany during the 1920s. And that's explained in the book as well. If you go back to the Frankfurt School and more recently the Cultural Revolution of the 60s, with the rise of Vietnam moratoriums, the hippie movement, youth culture, the birth control pill, feminism, gay rights, what's happened is that classical Marxism, it's no longer an economic argument about, if you like, the modes and means of production, about the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. What's happened is that it's kind of morphed into what I call a rainbow alliance. And you see that literally in terms of the rainbow, how it's been captured by the left in terms of the LGBTQI plus movement, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer plus. And there's a plus because every week there's another category that we need to be aware of. But the argument is that the West is racist, homophobic, guilty of white supremacism, all of these sins. So there's nothing redeeming or beneficial. But the irony is, and it's mentioned in a couple of the previous speakers mentioned it, the irony is that even though the cultural left, as I call it, talk about liberty and freedom and not being oppressed, not being disadvantaged, at the same time as portraying themselves as a beacon of equality and freedom, they've become intolerant. And I'll refer to Camille Palia in a minute. But the argument that the cultural left is supporting freedom, it's a myth. Nothing could be further from the truth. And one of the reasons I went back to the manifesto in the early days of the Communist Party in Russia was if you go back to what they wrote, the argument was that Christianity in particular had to be abolished, cancelled, as we now say. And it was Antonio Gramsci, the Italian Marxist, who actually said, and there's a great Italian cultural critic and philosopher, Augusto Del Noce, he quotes Gramsci as saying that socialism would be the new religion that would destroy Christianity. So if you go back far enough, you can see the antecedents, if you like, of what we're now experiencing. Christianity was especially targeted, but it's obviously much broader now. And one of my heroines, and I'm happy to be gender specific, one of my heroines is Camille Palia, who describes herself as a non-binary person. And she's someone the left love to hate because she is off the left, from the left. And that was an interesting idea about the snake eating itself. But Palia, and I'll quote her, argues, "We are plunged once again into an ethical chaos where intolerance masquerades as tolerance and where individual liberty is crushed by the tyranny of the group." And we can all think of examples, I'm sure, of people who've been cancelled, or even institutions or bodies who have been cancelled, as they say. And in terms of Australia, some of the more prominent, apart from the Archbishop, some of the more prominent include Bill Leake, and I got to know his son, Johannes, who has done the cartoons for one of the books. But talking to Johannes, it's hard to talk about for Johannes, but he mentions the fact that his father died prematurely in many ways because of the pressure and the way he was being vilified and abused on social networking sites, and even being worried about his personal safety and that of his family. And all that Bill did, and if you talk to people like Aborigines that I know, Anthony Dillon at the ACU, or the new senator from Northern Territory, they agree that the only crime Bill committed was to tell the truth about what was happening in remote communities in terms of family breakdown. But anyway, Bill Leake, Israel Folau, Margaret Court are obvious examples. Barry Humphries, people don't know that his name was taken off the Melbourne Comedy Festival, I think last year, because he was critical of transgenderism. So And I made the point, some have already mentioned, such is the unforgiving nature of this cultural left attack on Christianity and freedom of expression, that they're now attacking their own people. So it's no longer somebody like me, who I'm proud to be a conservative and to get into the public square and argue the case. Once we vacate the public square, we've lost. And that's something, Archbishop, I respect what you do and David, holding events like this and being very public about your faith and what you believe. If we give up that battle, we've already lost. But what the cultural left is now doing is eating its own. I talked about Camille Palia. Germaine Greer is another, who's been no platformed because of her views about transgenderism. A recent example a lot of us didn't pick up in Australia was Barry Weiss, a journalist at the New York Times, who actually resigned and in her letter of resignation argued that she could no longer work at the newspaper because it was so controlled by groupthink, by this kind of cultural left, all-pervasive indoctrination, where if you questioned or even doubted, as she did, she was accused of what she called wrong think. And it's very Orwellian, and I taught literature for many years. It's very Orwellian, 1984, for those who've read it, would know that freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. Winston works for the Ministry of Truth, which is all about rewriting the past, which happens under socialism, of course. But what Barry Weiss was talking about is this all-pervasive sense of what I talk about in terms of the book, language control and groupthink. And as an English teacher, it concerns me because, as Orwell said, once you can control language, you control how people think. And if you can determine how they conceptualise and argue and debate and the language, then you've won the argument, because it's like 1984, where what some people call cognitive dissonance or doublethink is all pervasive. And that's part of the danger in education. As I say, I taught for many years. Another example is, and it was quite interesting, over 150 authors and writers signed a public letter to Harper's Magazine, most of them of the left, arguing that this indoctrination and political correctness had gone too far and that it was time to have some civility in the debate and some respect for the argument. Now, the question is, why has it come to this? And again, if you go back to Lenin, his argument was and is that no matter how reprehensible, any action is justified if it furthers the cause of the revolution. And I mentioned Del Noce. He summarises Lenin as arguing, morality is whatever brings about the success of the proletarian revolution. So if you look at Marxism, it's underpinned by the conviction every kind of violence, every ruse, every illegal action, every dissimulation, every deception becomes licit if it is deemed to be necessary to reach the goal. And many of you would have read Machiavelli, the end justifies the means. So there's no ethical or moral judgment or any sense of the virtues that we heard about this morning. It's about a very hard, I would say, evil approach to changing society and really overthrowing Western culture, Western civilization, institutions like the family. And you only have to look at history to prove how destructive this idea has been, this concept. Now, whether it's, and I was rereading the Gulag, Solzhenitsyn, whether it's communism and the Gulag, whether it's the killing fields in Cambodia with Pol Pot, whether it's Mao and the millions who starved and were murdered, it's never had a good ending. It's never really worked, and it just staggers me. There was a survey a couple of years ago by the CIS in Sydney, and it's an indictment of our education system. A lot of millennials, I think it was over 50%, couldn't understand why Marxism wasn't a good idea, and they couldn't quite see why Western democracies were beneficial. And it just staggers belief that you can have young people who've gone through 12 years of schooling, possibly university, and they don't really know any history, or they don't know about how Western culture, Western society, and especially Christianity, which is again the second book, Christianity Matters. There's a great chapter by Augusto Zimmermann arguing in some detail how Christianity underpins our Westminster parliamentary form of government and our English common law. And I wrote an article recently where I suggested two things that came with the First Fleet arriving in what is now Botany Bay in Sydney. Two things, the King James version of the Bible and Blackstone's Laws of England. And it's because of those two foundation documents that we enjoy the liberty and the freedoms we now have that are under threat, but certainly not as bad as North Korea or China or Putin's Russia. And just as an aside, it troubled me, and I finished the article by saying, every day now I'm told I have to acknowledge Aboriginal elders and culture and history and spirituality, which is rife through the national curriculum, hundreds of references in what's taught in prep to year 10, hundreds. And I think there are 5 references to Christianity. And these are all the subjects prep to year 10. So again, cognitive dissonance. They will tell me that I have to respect the elders, the Indigenous elders, but when I say, well, what about our elders, the West? Whether it's the great books, whether it's the great historical figures, whether it's the great epochs like the Enlightenment, I'm told, well, you're a white supremacist. You have to be cancelled. To get to Marcuse, who I mentioned, in the Frankfurt School, and they were responsible for the rise of critical theory, is a very significant aspect of what they did, and the rise of cultural Marxism. The argument basically is such is the exploitive and oppressive nature of capitalist society that radicals are free to use any strategy or method to overthrow society, to challenge the status quo. Instead of being, and I would actually call it an inherent good, and we could talk about that, but instead of being inherently good, tolerance is condemned because tolerance is an instrument used by capitalist society to marginalise and oppress the other, who are all those disadvantaged groups, identity groups, and that's why we have the rise of victimhood and identity politics. So the argument from Marcuse, and he wrote this during the late 60s, I think it was early 70s, tolerance is only there to strengthen the tyranny of the majority under capitalism. So he writes, the conclusion is the realisation of the objective of tolerance must call for intolerance toward the prevailing policies and attitudes. And so the argument is society is so riven with oppression and disadvantage and inequality under the name of tolerance that we must be intolerant to overthrow them. to change society. And I'll quote from Jennifer Oriel. I mentioned she wrote the chapter. Marcuse argued for a new form of inequality won by censoring dissent. And it did become inequality. But the point was to try and censor dissent. He wrote, the subversive majority could be established by undemocratic means, including the withdrawal of toleration of speech and assembly. He proposed rigid restrictions on education, intolerance towards research that did not support the revolutionary aim. So what Marcuse, and we see this often not as explicit, but we see it in terms of the research that most universities now undertake. Because if you put together a proposal, if you don't tick all the requisite boxes on diversity and difference and respecting the other and being hostile towards white supremacism and not being Eurocentric, you won't get the funding. And you won't be published. So this critique has led to a significant restriction on free speech, obviously. And what's happened is that this sort of radical group, this Rainbow Alliance, it's kind of coalesced. And while they might be in disagreement, they are very much in agreement about Western civilization, including Christianity, being condemned as obsolete, oppressive, and having to be, as to use their word, cancelled. So you have this sort of Rainbow Alliance, and we see it every day, every week, whether it's a whole debates about transgenderism, frankly, whether it's a debate about the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the need for an Indigenous, change the Constitution to have an Indigenous voice. We see it in terms of the attacks on the family and marriage. We see it in education all the time. And part of it is to always present the other as the victims and the ones deserving of respect. Free and open discussion, as I mentioned, is replaced by mind control. Any who disagree are cancelled. And one of the things that troubled me, I can remember doing matriculation, and that dates me, I know, but in Victoria we did have matriculation at year 12, and we used to do what they called clear thinking in English. And we were taught about rhetoric and about debate and argument and about logic and rationality and reason. And the problem is now, and this is one reason I stopped teaching English in Victoria, under the new sort of higher school certificate, if you look at English, it's no longer about rationality and reason, it's more about emotion and feeling and what someone called the vibe. You have to be with that, and that's a silly expression from the 60s. David might remember it. You were an old hippie, weren't you? But what happens now, and I think it was Voltaire, I think, therefore I am. Now it's I feel, therefore I'm right. And I had an argument with my lovely daughter, God bless her, who wanted to vote in favour of same-sex marriage. And I tried to work out why she felt that was necessary. And I think after a while even she realised she didn't have any arguments that were rational or logical or kind of empirically sort of proven, if you could. It was more like the vibe. It was the feel. And that's part of the problem with education now, that we're no longer even at university level. There's no longer this sense of being autonomous or independent learners. It's more about having to conform to the groupthink. And I'll quote Christopher Latch. Once knowledge is equated with ideology, which is what's happened, It's no longer necessary to argue with opponents on intellectual grounds or to enter into their point of view. It is enough to dismiss them as Eurocentric, racist, sexist, homophobic, in other words, as politically correct. So, and this was Christopher Latch writing, I think, 20, 30 years ago. But in fact, that's what's happened in terms of the academy. That now, if you dissent or argue the case and disagree, it's shut down straight away. Even to the extent many of you would know where we now have safe spaces, trigger warnings. There are diversity guidelines and handbooks now for all the universities, warning about particular words or phrases. The Flinders University has one which says, and again, it's a debate. People seem to forget you can actually say something not to offend or to vilify, but you can say something to posit an argument. And so rather than condemning me, let's look at the argument. Let's look at the logic and how it stacks up. But anyway, the Flinders University talks about you cannot describe primitive or Aboriginal culture as primitive, or that you can't say that being heterosexual is in any way beneficial or more advantageous than being LGBTQI+. There are kind of markers now that we all know where we know not to step over, and I'm often guilty of doing it quite a lot. But, I'd like to finish on a positive note. And I do believe in God's grace of all things after so many years of fighting this fight. You've got to call out the nature, the true nature of the cultural left. You have to reveal them for what they are and don't simply accept what the prevailing ethos is. You have to call it out and you have to enter the public square and debate the issue, whether it's magazines, whether it's books, whether it's newspapers, whether it's radio, TV, whether it's the internet, whether it's having your own blog. And you've got to reassert the primacy of rational argument and debate. Now, by the by, I think it was Pope John Paul, I could be wrong, who talked about the two wings of a butterfly. Is that right? Two wings of a butterfly? Faith and reason?
No, butterfly.
What was it?
That's my topic.
We'll have to wait for yours. Yeah, but faith and reason. Yeah, I mean, rationality doesn't give you everything, but it is important. And, some years ago I spoke at Campion College. The Ramsay Centre has started to get off the ground, not without a few misgivings, I must admit. In America, there are a whole range of think tanks and colleges, liberal arts colleges. I'm part of what they call the Heterodox Academy, that do a lot of good work. The National Association of Scholars is another one. The Conservative Woman I mentioned. Barry Weiss has started up her own blog, Common Sense. So people are lighting small fires, and I like that expression. And to me, that's a good sign because I'm an optimist and I believe, and somebody said before, there is a thirst in young people, I believe, until it's been knocked out of them by an education system that doesn't really address it. There is a thirst for wanting to know, who am I? Why am I here? How do I achieve fulfilment? What constitutes the common good? How do I relate to other people? I mean, we are social creatures. We have a soul, we have an intellect. And so I'm always of the opinion that will reassert itself. And I'm organising a conference or a one-day event later in the year that David's coming to, thankfully, and Diff is coming, where I've looked at in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, there are at least 8 or 10 groups of parents, communities, business people I know who are starting up their own independent schools, non-government, often outside the church, but independently minded schools. And a lot of parents are coalescing realising such is their moral obligation to their children, currently not being met by schools, that they want to start their own. And the other thing I'll leave you with is satire and irony and humour. And, you know, one of my favourite authors is Jonathan Swift. And some of you would know I used to teach the kids A Modest Proposal about how to cure the Irish problem, where it talks about 3-month-old babies being quite delectable and making good gloves. And this is Year 9 boys. It normally took them 3 or 4 days to get what Swift was on about. But again, it's something we no longer teach in English. Irony, satire, humour. And I actually wrote one for the Australian Spectator, which I shouldn't say, but arguing I was a tree. So if you look at the Spectator, Kevin Donnelly, you'll see I wrote an article, I'm a tree. Because it's all now about self-identity. It's all about self-realisation. It's all about, if it feels good, do it. And forget about biology or forget about anatomy or the reality of life. I'm a tree. And the editor put at the start of the article, this is satire. Which kind of defeated the whole purpose. But thank you very much for putting up with me. And I'm sorry, I hope I haven't ruined your talk.